When it comes to the U.S.-China relationship and kind of the stance of the U.S. going into these talks, how would you characterize the U.S.'s outlook? We talk a lot about decoupling and the prospects of decoupling. Can you, with a definition or synthesize sort of what the outlook is going into these talks?
Well, it's really good to be with you. And, you know, I'm going to use one word to really underscore what is happening today and going into Thursday. President Trump and President Xi Jinping's meeting is complicated. Complicated. I think each country is going to demand of the others things that are just not going to be negotiable. That's sort of at the outset. China wants the U.S. to oppose Taiwan's independence. The United States needs rare earth. We need magnets. We need magnets for our military capabilities. And so far, what I've seen in these sort of negotiations framework deals is easing of China off its export ban, but that doesn't say much. That doesn't mean that China has made absolutely clear that our military, our defense capabilities will not get rare earths, will not get the magnets that we need for the motors. Imagine military equipment, all the motors that go into that. China's made clear it doesn't want to do that. The U.S. has made clear, Rubio just doubled down on it this the other day, Secretary Rubio, the U.S. is going to not give in to China's demand for reunification, for the U.S. to oppose Taiwanese independence. So negotiating positions are really tough going in, despite sort of these small bites around the apple framework concessions that we've gotten so far from one another.
That's right where I want to go. So you had the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and the U.S. Trade Representative kind of setting the table for the conversation that's going to take place on Thursday. I think there was some happiness that it didn't go badly. They were able to accomplish something and get that framework in place. If you look at this as a spectrum, sort of how far along are we in getting to a deal as a result of what's taken place? Yes, in Malaysia, but at the meetings that preceded it in Europe. Where are we in that spectrum of getting to a deal with China?
What a great way of looking at it, and I really want to underscore that this is the way to look at it is a time frame in the spectrum of the time frame of our history with China. We had a phase one deal with China in the first Trump administration. Myself, my colleagues, we were all part of sort of negotiating the terms of that. And I think everybody knew on some level that the Chinese might not adhere to the terms of the phase one deal. And so the years progress and the Chinese don't adhere to the phase one deal. All the while, President Xi Jinping has consolidated power in China. He's indigenized critical capabilities, and he's gotten stronger control of those critical supply chains. So, and then we see in the summer of last year, China imposed export bans on gallium, germanium, antimony. This year, they just roll out more export bans, but they're not giving us what we need. And so when you judge China in terms of its actions, not its words, it tells a very different story. They're not ready to play ball. They don't want to play ball. And because of all the consolidation of power and supply chains, they're ready to continue to not play ball because they know that they hold a lot of the cards right now.
Regrets, I've had a few. I'm curious, as you think about that phase one deal, sort of what happened with it that you think that the folks negotiating this deal are going to keep in mind? So there's that level of enforcement that wasn't there. What does that tell us about the way they should be approaching these conversations in light of how that played out?
You know, I think the U.S. has really boxed itself into a corner. So it's going to push China for a deal, and it's going to say enforcement. And my key enforcement mechanism is tariffs. But what do the tariffs do? They impact the markets. And we know President Trump is looking at the markets, Secretary Bessent is looking at the markets constantly, and they want to signal to, obviously, U.S. investors in the world that the U.S. has a strong market. You can't have it both ways. You can't have a trade deal with China with strong enforcement and be willing to use your enforcement levers because China never adheres to deals. We have a 25-year history of China at the World Trade Organization where it hasn't adhered to any of its commitments. So now we're going to strengthen our negotiating tactics with enforcement, but we're not willing to use the enforcement levers because of the markets. The administration has backed itself into a corner. I'm sure they're going to figure out a way out, but it's going to be tricky.
You know well the novel approach to trade that this president has. I want to ask you about kind of the corporate side of these deals. So if you look at what was inked over the course of the weekend, some deals for planes were agreed to as a part of all of this. I think about what's going to happen with conversations with Korean leadership and with Japanese leadership. The Japanese agreed to this very sizable investment they're going to make in the U.S. to get those tariff rates lowered. How complicated work is that going to be to figure that out? And how novel is that to impose upon a country like Japan, or have Japan make an investment of that size, which I think is like 10% of their economy?
I think before getting to, I think you touched on this too. I think let's unpack the Malaysia even a framework deal, because I think that illustrates the complexity. So part of the framework deal with Malaysia is certainly buy planes, but also open up your markets to more U.S. exports, but also don't restrict exports of rare earths to the United States. But most of the investments in rare earths processing facilities and mines in Malaysia are Chinese, and the Chinese have blocking laws that says you don't adhere to U.S. laws or any laws that conflict with Chinese laws. What is Malaysia going to do? What can it potentially legally do? It's going to have to either give in to China or give in to the United States, and it won't do 100% all U.S. and 100%. It's going to do this balancing act, and we might wake up and realize that what we thought we had agreed with Malaysia isn't going to pan out. Same thing, I think, with Japan. Japan has committed to $550 billion investments here. They don't know what they're going to invest in. They don't know if the critical capabilities in the U.S. they're going to invest in are going to align with where Japan needs to go. And those supply chains are here. And Japan needs supply chains at home. Japan needs, this is the amount that they committed to invest is about 10% of their economy. Yeah. Right? They need to increase military spending and get their supply chains in order, too, because China has a choke point on global supply chains in terms of rare earths, industrial diamonds, et cetera. So Japan's in a tough spot as well.
Maybe I could ask you lastly just about the conversations taking place or not taking place in this hemisphere. So we reported today that Mexico is going to have a bit of an extension on delay on as it continues to talk with the U.S. Canada not in that position right now. Those talks are not taking place, and it sounds like there's unlikely to be a conversation between the Prime Minister and the President anytime soon. How are you thinking about the progress of negotiations here in the North American hemisphere?
I think it's very likely that USMCA is going to be renegotiated, but then we're going to have some really strong side deals with Canada separately and with Mexico separately. And the reason is that their asks of them are going to be very different. Our trade and our dependencies are going to be very different. And with Mexico, this is sort of what I alluded to about Malaysia, lots of Chinese investments in Mexico. And how are we going to deal with rules of origin? How do we treat the products that come from Mexico with substantial Chinese origin input into them? That's going to complicate our discussions with Mexico, with the rest of the world, when we ask that we impose higher tariffs on goods containing Chinese materials.